In late August and September 1944, as German forces abandoned Estonia and evacuated 91,000 soldiers and 85,000 civilian refugees by ship, they inadvertently handed the Soviet Baltic Fleet its greatest strategic opportunity of the war. The evacuation, delayed by political indecision and military miscalculation, came not as the swift, decisive withdrawal that German naval doctrine demanded, but as a reluctant, piecemeal retreat that exposed the fundamental weakness of a navy caught between competing imperatives. What should have been a controlled strategic withdrawal became instead a demonstration of how timing, that most unforgiving element of naval warfare, can transform tactical necessity into strategic catastrophe. The irony was precise, measured, devastating. The Soviet submarine Baltic Sea campaign in 1944, which had been restrained until Finland signed the Moscow Armistice on September 9, 1944, suddenly found itself unleashed at the exact moment when German evacuation traffic reached its peak vulnerability. German planners had counted on completing their Baltic withdrawals before Soviet naval forces could effectively penetrate the defensive barriers that had protected German shipping since 1941. They calculated wrong. The delay cost them not just ships and lives, but the fundamental equation of naval power in the Baltic Sea itself. This is the chronicle of that miscalculation. How a 6-week delay in German evacuation operations transformed the Soviet Baltic Fleet from a contained, frustrated force into the dominant naval power in the Baltic, and how the mechanical realities of naval logistics, when subjected to the pressure of political indecision, can reshape the strategic balance of an entire theatre of war. By the summer of 1944, the Baltic Sea had become a study in compressed naval geography and multiplying strategic pressures. The Red Banner Baltic Fleet, despite being the largest navy on the Baltic Sea with 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 19 destroyers, 68 submarines, and a naval air arm comprising 709 aircraft, had been effectively bottled up in the eastern Gulf of Finland since 1941. German and Finnish minefields, deployed with methodical precision across the narrow waters between Tallinn and Helsinki, had created what naval strategists termed an impenetrable anti-submarine barrier, a statement that would prove to carry the seeds of its own contradiction. The German position appeared, on its surface, to be one of measured control. Army Group North held defensive positions across Estonia and Latvia. The Kriegsmarine maintained secure sea lanes for military supplies and civilian evacuations. Finnish naval cooperation provided additional depth to the anti-submarine barriers. The Germans had successfully laid a series of minefields across the Gulf of Finland, and as the Soviet fleet made no attempt to flee to the Atlantic or neutral Sweden, Germany eventually withdrew its capital ships. This withdrawal would prove to be both logical and disastrous. Logical because it freed resources for other theatres, disastrous because it signalled to Soviet planners the true extent of German naval confidence in their static defences. Yet beneath this apparent stability lay the fundamental mechanical reality that would determine the course of events. In September 1944, negotiations between the Soviet Union and Finland led to a truce, demanding the evacuation of Finland by German troops, while at the same time a big Soviet offensive against Estonia and Latvia forced the German Army Group North to evacuate both countries. The convergence of these two strategic pressures, the loss of Finnish cooperation and the collapse of Baltic positions, created a temporal compression that German evacuation planning had not anticipated. The evacuation would have to be conducted not in the measured phases that doctrine suggested, but in the hurried confusion of simultaneous military and political collapse. The Soviet position, conversely, was one of frustrated potential gradually transforming into operational opportunity. The previous year's offensive had failed completely. In the spring of 1943, the Germans had anchored a double net at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, and despite all efforts, no Soviet submarine succeeded in getting through to the Baltic. The Soviet submarine force had been reduced to training exercises and coastal defense missions, its offensive capability effectively neutralized by German defensive engineering. Soviet naval doctrine built around the concept of fleet-in-being operations and submarine interdiction of enemy sea lines of communication had been rendered theoretical by the simple mechanical reality of steel nets and contact mines. But the mechanical realities that had favored German defense in 1943 were shifting with mathematical precision towards Soviet advantage by September 1944. The Finnish armistice negotiations, conducted under the pressure of Soviet military success on land, would soon eliminate the northern anchor of the German anti-submarine barrier system. More critically, German evacuation requirements would force surface ship movements through precisely those waters where Soviet submarines, once freed from their defensive constraints, could operate with maximum tactical advantage. The German evacuation planning process revealed the inherent tension between military necessity and political ideology that characterized much of Third Reich's strategic decision-making in the war's final phases. Hitler's instinctive opposition to any operation that implied retreat created a planning environment where preparation for evacuation had to be conducted, in the words of one Kriegsmarine staff officer, quietly, since Hitler opposed such measures. Planning for Operation Hannibal started in late 1944, although it was done quietly since Hitler opposed such measures. This political constraint transformed what should have been a systematic, doctrine-driven operation into an improvised response to rapidly deteriorating conditions. Rear Admiral Konrad Engelhardt, tasked with coordinating the Baltic evacuations, faced a planning challenge that multiplied in complexity with each week of delay. By the end of 1944, Engelhardt had assembled a fleet of 22 former passenger liners, each weighing over 10,000 tons, plus 23 freighters of more than 5,000 tons, and many other smaller ships. The numbers suggested capability. The reality demonstrated the gap between theoretical capacity and operational effectiveness. The converted passenger liners, designed for peacetime comfort and safety, would have to operate in waters increasingly dominated by Soviet submarines, with inadequate escort protection and under the constant threat of air attack. The timing issue compounded every other aspect of the evacuation challenge. German military doctrine emphasized the principle of operating inside the enemy's decision cycle, completing necessary movements before opposing forces could effectively respond. The Soviet submarine Baltic Sea campaign in 1944, which had been restrained until Finland signed the Moscow Armistice on September 9, 1944, enabled the Soviet Navy to avoid the minefield barrages in the Gulf of Finland that caused heavy losses in 1942 and prevented success in 1943. The German evacuation, by extending into late September and early October, would coincide precisely with the moment when Soviet submarines gained operational freedom in the Baltic for the first time since 1941. September 9, 1944, thus represented what military analysts term a decision point, the moment when the strategic balance shifted definitively from one side to another. Submarines Shock 310, Shock 310, and Shock 407 were the first to operate in open Baltic from Finnish harbours, and navigating out of the dangerous zones with aid of Finnish naval officers. They were soon followed by other 12 submarines. The significance of Finnish naval cooperation cannot be overstated. Finnish officers, with their intimate knowledge of local waters and German defensive arrangements, provided Soviet submarines with precisely the tactical intelligence needed to circumvent 3 years of German defensive engineering. The mechanical aspects of the evacuation revealed additional vulnerabilities. The German anti-submarine forces were relatively weak up to the end of 1944. The few destroyers and torpedo boats, as well as the fleet minesweepers, were mostly used to support the hard-pressed army in the coastal areas and to provide AS and AA escort to the cruisers bombarding the positions of the Red Army. German escort capacity had been systematically degraded by competing military priorities. The surface units needed to protect evacuation convoys were simultaneously required for close fire support to German ground forces under intense Soviet pressure. This represented a classic example of strategic overstretch, insufficient forces attempting to meet incompatible operational requirements. The Soviet response demonstrated the tactical flexibility that comes from having a clear, uncomplicated objective. The Soviet High Command wanted to disrupt or sever the supply routes from the western Baltic and the Bay of Danzig to Liepāja and Ventspils, not only by their strengthened air forces, but also by the use of submarines and torpedo cutters, while the bigger surface vessels were held back by Stalin's order to conserve these ships as training vessels for the new Big High Seas Fleet program. This strategic guidance provided Soviet submarine commanders with operational clarity, attack German shipping wherever found, with priority given to troop transports and supply vessels supporting the isolated German forces in the Courland Pocket. The first Soviet successes came with mechanical precision. On 6 October, Soviet submarine Scheit 407 torpedoed and sunk German merchant Nordstern 1127 GRT west of Klaipėda. On 8 October, Soviet submarine Scheit 30 torpedoed and sunk the German dredger Bagger 3 400 GRT, and shortly later torpedoed and sunk the German transport ship Ruhr 24 4499 GRT west of Ventspils. These attacks, conducted within 48 hours of each other, demonstrated that Soviet submarines had successfully penetrated the German defensive system and were operating with tactical freedom in previously secure German waters. The pattern established in early October would continue with devastating consistency throughout the autumn and winter months. German evacuation traffic, forced to follow predictable routes through increasingly dangerous waters, became what submarine warfare specialists term a target-rich environment. The delayed timing of the German evacuation had transformed what should have been a controlled withdrawal into a running battle between increasingly vulnerable German convoys and increasingly confident Soviet submarine forces. The military climax of the delayed German evacuation came not with a single decisive engagement, but through the relentless accumulation of tactical defeats that over the course of 3 months fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Baltic Sea. Differently from the past offensives, no Soviet submarine was lost due mine or enemy action, while a number of merchants and few German warships were sunk. This operational success rate, achieving tactical objectives without corresponding losses, indicated that Soviet submarine operations had moved beyond the experimental phase into systematic interdiction of German sea lines of communication. The German evacuation from Estonia, conducted between September 18 and 23, illustrated both the potential and the limitations of the delayed withdrawal strategy. While successful, the offensive begun too late to seriously interfere with the German naval evacuation of Revel. Between 18 and 23 September 1944, German forces managed to extract most personnel and critical equipment from Estonian ports. But the operation succeeded only because Soviet submarine forces had not yet achieved full operational deployment. This narrow window of tactical success would prove to be the last favorable outcome for German naval operations in the Baltic. October 1944 marked the decisive shift in naval initiative. Between October and December 1944, the Soviet Navy employed the 3 submarines L-3, L-21 and Lembit, capable of min-laying operations in offensive actions, laying 77 mines. The Soviet approach combined direct torpedo attacks with systematic mining of German shipping routes, a dual-threat strategy that forced German convoys to operate in increasingly restricted waters while facing multiple forms of underwater warfare. On 11 October, submarine L-3 laid a field of mines off Cape Arcona. These mines hit German training ship Albert Leo Schlageter on 14 November and sunk German fleet torpedo boat T-34 on 20 November. The effectiveness of Soviet min-laying operations demonstrated the compound nature of the German strategic failure. Each minefield laid by Soviet submarines not only claimed immediate victims but also forced German convoy routing into increasingly predictable patterns. German minesweeping capacity, already stretched by competing operational requirements, could not keep pace with the systematic mining campaign. On 11 October, submarine Lembit laid mines off Kolberg. These mines hit German harbour tug Pioner 5, German auxiliary patrol vessel V305 Halberstadt, German fishing vessel Spreeufer, and German minesweeper M41. The targeting of German minesweeping assets represented sophisticated operational planning, eliminating the German capability to counter Soviet mine warfare while simultaneously expanding the areas denied to German shipping. November and December 1944 witnessed the full operational deployment of Soviet submarine forces operating from Finnish bases. The Baltic Sea submarines resumed combat operations in September 1944 from the ports of defeated Finland. During the 8 months before the end of the war, they destroyed 72 enemy transport and combatant ships. This figure, 72 ships destroyed in 8 months, represented a rate of attrition that German evacuation operations could not sustain. More significantly, it indicated that Soviet submarine operations had achieved what naval strategists term interdiction dominance, the ability to disrupt enemy sea lines of communication faster than the enemy could replace losses or develop effective countermeasures. The human cost of the delayed evacuation became apparent through the systematic targeting of German troop transports. The submarine S-13, under command of Captain of the 3rd Rank A, Marinsko, who in January 1945 in one cruise destroyed the fascist military transport ship Wilhelm Gustloff of 205,484 tons, and then the transport ship General von Steuben of 14,660 tons. These ships carried 10,000 fascists, including 3,000 submariners. The sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff in particular represented both a tactical success for Soviet submarine warfare and a humanitarian catastrophe that highlighted the human cost of strategic miscalculation. The ship, built to carry a few thousand people, was now bulging with some 10,000 people, including 4,000 children. The mechanical precision of Soviet submarine operations during this period revealed the extent to which delayed German evacuation had handed tactical initiative to Soviet naval forces. German convoys, operating under severe time pressure and with inadequate escort protection, became predictable targets for submarine commanders who now operated with detailed intelligence about German routing and scheduling. The delayed evacuation had transformed the fundamental equation of submarine warfare in the Baltic. Instead of Soviet submarines attempting to penetrate heavily defended German waters, German transports were forced to traverse waters increasingly dominated by Soviet submarine forces operating from secure bases with Finnish navigational support. The delayed German evacuation of the Baltic represents a case study in how tactical delays can produce strategic consequences far beyond their immediate operational impact. The 6-week postponement of evacuation operations from early August, when military conditions first suggested withdrawal, to late September, when political authority finally authorized the movement, created a window of vulnerability that Soviet naval forces exploited with systematic precision. When in early October the Soviet First Baltic Front broke through to the Baltic coast near Palanga, the German troops to the north were enclosed in the Courland bridgehead to be supplied only over the sea. This encirclement meant that German naval operations in the Baltic shifted from discretionary evacuation support to essential supply line maintenance, a change that multiplied both the volume of shipping and the strategic importance of maintaining sea control. The transformation of the Soviet Baltic Fleet during this period illustrates how naval power can be reconstituted through operational success rather than material expansion. 20 units then operated in the area until the end of hostilities. Although German traffic was stepped up considerably for the evacuation of the Baltic countries, a mere 21 vessels were sunk by the Soviets, amounting to 95,000 tons. While the absolute numbers of ships sunk might appear modest, the strategic impact was disproportionate. German evacuation operations required predictable scheduling, concentrated shipping, and reduced escort protection, exactly the conditions that favor submarine operations against surface vessels. The systematic nature of Soviet success reflected operational learning and tactical adaptation. The commanding officers of the Soviet submarines overestimated their successes, and especially the tonnage of the attacked ships greatly, probably because they lacked the necessary experience. Even accounting for the tendency toward overclaiming typical in submarine warfare, the pattern of Soviet attacks revealed increasingly sophisticated operational planning. Early attacks focused on isolated vessels and targets of opportunity. Later operations demonstrated coordinated timing, systematic route interdiction, and integrated mine warfare campaigns. The German response revealed the structural limitations of naval operations conducted under competing strategic pressures. The vessels of the Sicherungs division, mostly rebuilt fishing vessels, were mainly concerned with keeping the sea routes free of the British mines, and were badly equipped with AS weapons. German anti-submarine capacity had been configured to address British mine warfare and occasional submarine incursions, not systematic submarine operations conducted from secure bases with detailed intelligence support. The shift in threat profile from defensive mine clearing to active convoy protection required capabilities and resources that the German Baltic naval forces simply did not possess. The compound effects of the delayed evacuation extended beyond immediate tactical losses to fundamental changes in the strategic balance of naval power. By late 1944, Soviet submarine forces had achieved what the German anti-submarine barrier system had been designed to prevent: operational freedom in Baltic waters combined with the capability to interdict German sea lines of communication. The most glorious victories were gained by the submarine Lembit, under command of captain of the second rank A. Matyasevich. 25 victories included 22 transport and combatant ships destroyed by him personally. Individual submarine commanders achieving this level of operational success indicated that Soviet submarine operations had moved beyond opportunistic attacks to systematic campaign-level warfare. The delayed evacuation thus represents more than a tactical failure. It constitutes a demonstration of how the timing of military operations can determine their strategic context. German evacuation planning had assumed a permissive maritime environment protected by established defensive systems and cooperative Finnish forces. The 6-week delay meant that evacuations occurred in a transformed strategic environment, characterized by hostile submarine operations, systematic mining campaigns, and detailed enemy intelligence about German movements and vulnerabilities. By the spring of 1945, the delayed German evacuation had produced a complete reversal of naval power relationships in the Baltic Sea. Operation Hannibal resulted in the evacuation of an estimated 800,000 German civilians and approximately 350,000 soldiers to ports in Germany and Denmark. The numbers suggest operational success. The strategic reality demonstrated operational failure conducted at enormous cost under increasingly desperate conditions. The tragic sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, after being hit by torpedoes from a Soviet submarine, resulted in the loss of approximately 9,000 lives, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. The German evacuation continued into May 1945, but under conditions that revealed the complete transformation of the Baltic maritime environment. At 21 on 8 May 1945, the last day of the war, a convoy consisting of 92 large and small vessels left the Latvian city of Liepāja with 18,000 soldiers and civilians. This final convoy departed not as the culmination of a successful evacuation campaign, but as the last desperate attempt to extract German forces from positions that had become untenable precisely because of Soviet naval interdiction of supply lines. The Soviet Baltic Fleet had achieved, through the systematic exploitation of German strategic miscalculation, a position of naval dominance that no amount of defensive engineering or tactical innovation could have produced under normal operational conditions. Although opportunities had been very great and rich targets had travelled in slow convoys with scarcely any escort, it should be noted that not a single attempt was made to attack the important targets offered by German submarines on training cruises. This restraint in targeting, focusing on transport and supply vessels rather than military assets with limited operational value, demonstrated the strategic sophistication of Soviet naval planning during the final phases of the Baltic campaign. The delayed evacuation had provided Soviet submarine forces with what submarine warfare doctrine terms optimal attack conditions, predictable targets, concentrated shipping, reduced escort protection, and detailed intelligence about enemy movements. These conditions, created by German strategic indecision rather than Soviet tactical superiority, enabled the Soviet Baltic Fleet to achieve in 8 months what 3 years of offensive operations had failed to accomplish. The mechanical requirements of large-scale evacuation, regular schedules, concentrated shipping, predictable routes, had proved incompatible with the security requirements of contested waters. The German experience in the Baltic during 1944-1945 thus provides a precise illustration of how strategic timing can determine tactical outcomes. The 6-week delay in authorizing evacuation operations had transformed a manageable military withdrawal into a strategic catastrophe that handed naval dominance to Soviet forces and condemned German Baltic operations to a prolonged campaign of attrition conducted under increasingly desperate conditions. Military doctrine emphasizes the principle that time is the least recoverable of military resources. The German Baltic evacuation demonstrated the corollary. Strategic time once lost cannot be recovered through tactical excellence or operational innovation. The delayed German evacuation of the Baltic Sea in 1944 provides contemporary military planners with a study in how the mechanical realities of naval operations interact with strategic decision-making under pressure. The fundamental lesson emerges with mathematical clarity. Naval operations, because of their dependence on predictable schedules and concentrated shipping, are particularly vulnerable to strategic indecision that forces tactical execution under suboptimal conditions. Modern naval doctrine continues to grapple with the challenge that defeated German planning in the Baltic: how to coordinate complex evacuation operations while maintaining operational security and tactical flexibility. The German experience suggests that evacuation planning must begin with the assumption of hostile interdiction rather than permissive conditions. So only D2 and K-52 were damaged by depth charge attacks, and on 4 January S-4 was sunk by depth charges of the torpedo boat T3 off the Danzig Bay. The limited German anti-submarine successes, achieved only through concentrated escort efforts, indicate that effective convoy protection requires resource allocation incompatible with other operational requirements. The Soviet success in the Baltic demonstrates the compound advantages that accrue to naval forces operating from secure bases with detailed intelligence support. Finnish naval officers provided Soviet submarines with precisely the tactical intelligence needed to circumvent 3 years of German defensive engineering. Contemporary planners must consider how rapidly changing political relationships can transform strategic assumptions and operational constraints. The German defensive system, constructed with Finnish cooperation, became a liability when that cooperation shifted to Soviet advantage. The human cost of the delayed evacuation, measured not only in immediate casualties but in the prolonged suffering of civilian populations trapped in deteriorating military situations, provides a moral imperative for prompt strategic decision-making. German refugees were on the road in the winter of 1944-45, great columns of men, women and children, desperate to flee as the onrushing Soviets overran their homes. Military planners must recognize that humanitarian considerations and tactical requirements often align. Operations conducted under time pressure typically increase both military and civilian casualties. The architectural lesson of the German Baltic evacuation extends beyond naval warfare to the fundamental relationship between strategic planning and tactical execution. Strategic decisions create tactical conditions, tactical failures reflect strategic inadequacies. The German experience in the Baltic demonstrates that tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic miscalculation when the mechanical requirements of military operations come into conflict with the compressed timelines created by delayed decision-making. Contemporary military doctrine must account for the accelerated pace of strategic change that characterizes modern warfare. The 6-week delay that proved catastrophic for German Baltic operations in 1944 would represent an impossibly lengthy decision cycle in contemporary operational environments. Military institutions must develop strategic decision-making processes that can operate effectively under conditions of uncertainty, while recognizing that delayed decisions often prove more costly than imperfect decisions executed promptly. The delayed German evacuation of the Baltic Sea in 1944 stands as a memorial to strategic indecision and a demonstration of tactical precision. It reminds us that in naval warfare, as in engineering, the failure of one component can cascade through an entire system. The German delay handed the Soviet Baltic Fleet its greatest strategic victory, not through superior tactics or technological innovation, but through the simple mechanical reality that evacuation operations, once delayed beyond optimal timing, create the exact conditions that favor opposing submarine warfare. The lesson emerges with the clarity of tested steel. Strategic timing is not a luxury of optimal conditions, but a necessity of operational survival. In the Baltic Sea of 1944, 6 weeks of political indecision transformed a controlled withdrawal into a strategic catastrophe. The measure of that miscalculation was written in the tonnage of ships lost, the displacement of populations, and the fundamental shift in naval power that determined the character of Baltic operations until the end of the war. Time, as the German Baltic evacuation demonstrated, remains the least forgiving element of military planning. Once lost, it cannot be recovered through tactical innovation, operational excellence, or strategic revision. The Soviet Baltic Fleet achieved dominance not by overcoming German naval power, but by exploiting the window of vulnerability created when German strategic indecision forced tactical operations under suboptimal conditions. This is the enduring lesson of the delayed evacuation, that in naval warfare, mechanical precision and strategic timing are not separate considerations, but elements of a single operational equation. When strategic decisions are delayed beyond the temporal requirements of tactical execution, the result is not merely operational difficulty, but fundamental transformation of the strategic environment itself. The German experience in the Baltic serves as both historical record and contemporary warning, a demonstration of how the mechanical realities of naval operations, when subjected to the pressure of strategic indecision, can reshape the balance of naval power with mathematical inevitability and mechanical precision.